Whew. You guys have got to forgive me because I started smoking a cigarette because I'm kind of nervous. Put it out. Whew. It's crazy because, like, watching the trial, I followed the trial most of the way through. I didn't really watch much of the defense because I think they kind of made their defense and their rebuttals to the witnesses that the prosecution brought. But it was an emotional trial. I think this is probably one of the most emotional trials that I had watched because the prosecution did a really good job at painting George Floyd the man, as opposed to, what the defense was trying to do was put George Floyd on trial. So, I'm kind of at that point where I'm expecting anything. We'll see what happens. So, I mean, it's going to be at least another 10, 15 minutes before they come back on the TV. In the meantime, I'm going to try to do this on my web, so bear with me.
They describe themselves as being on pins and needles. Who can blame them?
Absolutely. And, I talked to his brother a few weeks before the trial ever took place. He was just explaining how difficult it is for his family to go through and to experience. But that's, as one individual, it's heartbreaking enough to lose someone just in general. But then to have the whole world stand by watching this, I would imagine the pressure that the brother feels is quite similar to the pressure the jury may be feeling right now. How does
I'll tell you, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing that I don't think has received the coverage it deserves is the safety of the jury and what it means to be one of those veneer people that are literally facing the kind of pressure they are. Now, I have the faith that they are not watching public reports and they're not listening to news reports, but it doesn't matter. They have up until this point, so that it's probably weighing heavily on them, whatever the aftermath is going to be. Now, that's a shame because that shouldn't matter. That's not what they're allowed to have to consider in coming to a decision. They have to only consider the evidence that was heard in the courtroom, that they're human beings. And it is for that reason that no doubt they're probably on pins and needles also, just praying for peace and safety in that community.
And Wendy, could you explain one thing for all of our viewers and even to me? We know that the jury was able to be sequestered on Monday when closing arguments took place. But for someone who's not familiar with the court system, how does sequestering work?
Sequestration is a last resort. I'm glad you asked me that question because I've never achieved it in any of my cases. I've been asking for it occasionally for 23 years. It is one of those things that's reserved for only the most serious cases, only the cases where there is such sensational, pervasive trial publicity that there is a serious issue of insulating a jury from those forces, not to mention the safety concerns here. So this is really a perfect storm for sequestration. And in fact, there are many people that wonder whether or not it might have been something discussed more fervently earlier on in the case. We know the defense asked for it, but it is a last resort. Jurors don't like it, but earlier on necessary here. And you wonder whether or not that actually helps the that jurors don't like it, but earlier on necessary here. Except for the common sense rationale that it allows them to focus on their task.
Sorry, I don't know what the heck just happened with my volume.
That's right. And, this case is like no other. We think we can look at precedent of what did we do in this case or that case. Right. And we really can't. This case has been unique for so many different reasons that they are taking every precaution.
That's enough. Okay, so I can't watch it in this. Shut up. Oh, because I'm watching it in the window. Okay. All right. I was just testing the subtitles. We're literally just watching right now the courtroom, the seal of the courtroom, and they're just commentating on every channel.
well, I won't tell you how many years ago because somebody will do the math.
Can
But
you guys
let's just
hear
say we didn't have the luxury
the speaking in
of
the
ever having
background? Can
anything
everybody hear the
videotaped.
speaking
In
in the
fact, in closing
background?
argument, we would say, well, it's not like we have a videotape of the scene, but now we do. So remember, the defense made this case about more than 9 minutes and 29 seconds. They had to, because that was the primary witness number one, was the videotape. Everything in the first 2 weeks surrounded that videotape. And in fact, to some extent,
good.
even the third week, it all stemmed from, can you believe what you see? That was a prosecution theme that was very clever and catchy.
It's crazy because everybody's getting excited. Let me mute her for a second. Everybody's getting excited because the verdict is in early, but yes, we got to keep in mind that the George Zimmerman trial verdict only took 16 hours. So, and that came back, obviously not guilty. So it's kind of difficult because if you watch the trial, you can kind of have an appreciation for the fact that it seems like it's open and shut, but at the same time, if you just look at the history of our nation, you'll understand why it's so nerve-wracking watching this. This also goes to the point that I was making, or that I'm going to be making in a video that I'm going to post later today on YouTube, is that we've got to, as a people, and this is not black or white, this is just as a people, we've got to do better at knowing what we know and being able to admit to ourselves what we don't know and be willing to commit to doing the research to know. So that way we don't find ourselves in a position where, we have this expectation of it has to come back, as all guilty because, we've got to do better at that. I prayed most of the morning. I'm hoping that it comes back as, a guilty verdict. But at the end of the day, I mean, do you ever really want, I shouldn't even pose that question because I know some of the answers that it'll get. But I mean, I guess this is really rhetorical for me to ask myself. Like, do you ever really want to see somebody end up, losing their life, no matter what? And that's a struggle to deal with. At the end of the day, I think that Chauvin should be held accountable to the fullest extent. But in a sense, taking another man's life is, I don't know. So, let's just go back to this for a little bit. I'm gonna leave out of the view of the camera for a little bit, and I'm gonna keep the commentary. Sorry, on the.
In Derek Chauvin's mind when he did what he did. I bet they waited for that, although logically they probably understood they didn't have to hear from Derek Chauvin, and they didn't. But that videotape was the number one piece of evidence that both sides had to work with, and it was the most important piece of evidence in the whole trial.
Absolutely. And you're speaking to the fact that Derek Chauvin never took the stand in order to provide a testimony as to what was happening inside of his head and that very moment where his knee was on George Floyd's neck. And that was his Fifth Amendment right not to take a stand. Do you think that was a good call for him, or do you think it would have been better for him to plead his case in front of the jury and the public?
If this were a case where it was a split-second decision, officer-involved shooting or something like that, as opposed to 9 minutes and 29 seconds, I used to be a criminal defense attorney, I would have said, look, humanize yourself to the jury, take off your mask, talk to them about your job and what it is you were thinking and feeling and experiencing. But this was 9 minutes and prove. Remember, not his innocence. He doesn't have to prove anything, and the prosecution doesn't have to overcome every possible doubt. It's prove that he's not guilty, maybe, or have a verdict of not guilty. The defense has no burden whatsoever. So the second question was also good. You can move this case to the moon, and some prospective jury pool would have heard about it and seen the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So all of that together has many people believing that it maybe should have been a change of venue. But then the ultimate question becomes, where could you have moved it to? Where everybody in the jury pool wouldn't have seen the video. All they have to do, remember, is say that they can be fair. I'm paraphrasing because obviously a lot more than that goes into jury selection. But the test is not whether anybody has seen footage or have heard about the case, but given what they've already seen and what they already know of the fact pattern, can they nonetheless give both sides a fair trial? And these brave men and women on this jury said that they could.
Absolutely. And just to explain the difference between innocence and not guilty, there's a term called reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Could you explain that whenever it comes to a verdict, and just in general?
You're muted, but it looked like you just asked me a great question.
I did ask you a really great question. Can you hear me still?
Still muted. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
1 second. Can you hear me now? Still working. Wendy, can you hear me now?
I can indeed.
Okay,
yes.
excellent. Here we go. So I asked you a question about Derek Chauvin proving he's innocent, but just to provide some additional clarity, it's not about proving innocence. It's about proving not guilty in connection to beyond a reasonable doubt he did not commit this crime. Could you explain from a legal perspective what not guilty truly does mean and what it will mean in this case?
Absolutely. So in every criminal case, the defense has zero burden. They don't have to prove anything. They can just sit there at the table and listen to the prosecution present their evidence, their witnesses, etc. The defendant is also not found innocent if the prosecution. A jury renders a verdict of not guilty. What that means is there wasn't enough evidence to prove the charges. It's certainly it's not a declaration of factual innocence. It's simply recognizing that the government didn't meet its burden. Now, criminal cases often involve, as Derek Chauvin's case did, the defense putting on a full case. In other words, they don't have to prove anything, but they choose to mount a defense. And we knew this was going to happen here because that's what opening statements were about the dueling narratives we were about to hear, and we did hear throughout the course of this 3-week trial. But the fact that there is that option for the jury, that there isn't an innocence option. There's only the option of saying, we understand the charges, we listen to the evidence, but government, you failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the elements of the crimes that you charged.
All right, and we know that the verdict should be read between 3:30 and 4 p.m. Central Time. It is 3:27 p.m. right now, so we are still waiting to hear what the verdict will be. I just have to ask you because everyone wants to know if it does come back that he is found not guilty. What would that mean for the reaction of the protesters and the people who have been demanding justice for George Floyd?
Oh, I hesitate to think of the reaction that we fear because we are praying for peace and safety for that community, regardless of what the verdict is. But I will share that conventional wisdom, I hate to say that because juries
I just want to remind everybody too that the verdict is not just on one of the charges. The jury is instructed to deliver a verdict on each of the charges. She's going to explain it. Never mind.
None of the three. That our hearts and prayers, if it is a not guilty verdict on all three, is that the community listen to what the family members.
In the comments, here's what he was charged with.
Which is peace, which is non-violence. They can peacefully protest, but we all pray for non-violence. And I really hope that that's exactly what happens if that's the verdict. But again, quick verdicts traditionally favor the prosecution and favor a guilty verdict on at least one of the counts. We'll see if I'm right.
We will see. We'll see, that's for sure. Now, another question I do have to ask you before you leave us, like I really want to see the possibility of an appeal. For the past 24 hours, a lot of people have been talking about the chances of an appeal in this case because of some representatives that we've had that were out there. Also, the chance of an appeal in this case, just because the jury is so saturated with information from outside sources. What's the likelihood that Derek Chauvin and his team of attorneys will fight to get an appeal in this case, if in fact he is found guilty for any of the charges?
High. I don't know how it could be any higher because of the reasons you mentioned. This is.
Let's switch to a different broadcast for you guys.
The tree publicity was absolutely overwhelming to the extent that we actually did have many people thinking, maybe a change of venue would have behooved both sides in sort of moving this out of a ground zero, so to speak. And then the other issue, and it's not just Congress people or the president or whoever is weighing in, it's everything that goes along with the way people behave when they're discussing such a high case. So suffice it to say the defense would be able to break down many different avenues to pursue in mounting an appeal. And of course they would appeal, especially on a case this sensational. They have nothing to lose by an appeal. So we would expect exactly that to happen
And as you heard yesterday, even the judge suggested, and I won't mention it again, I know it's been all over the air, an additional, or what I should say, one of the avenues potentially for an appeal.
Another question for you, Wendy, is the legal term known as causation. I know that this is going to come into play, especially with this case and how George died. A lot of the testimony that we saw from both sides include the medical experts who weighed in on how he died and what led to his death. Could you explain to people what causation is and how this will come into play when it comes to the verdict?
Causation was one of the elements that the prosecution had to prove. In other words, they had to prove that George Floyd didn't just happen to die from a drug overdose after the 9.5 minutes with a knee on the neck. And they also didn't have to prove, they had to prove that George Floyd didn't just die of an enlarged heart or some other condition. Everybody agrees it's a horrible tragedy that his dead, and our heart just bleeds for the family and the community. But the charges specifically require Derek Chauvin to have been responsible, at least substantially responsible. Remember the way that it's a little bit nuanced in the way it's phrased. So cause of death was one of the biggest issues in the case. We knew this was going to be true since right after the opening statement. They have to prove, they being the government, that it was ex-officer Chauvin's conduct that caused the death, at least substantially. So goes the argument. And that's what the jury was instructed, because that's the state of the law. So that is one of the reasons you saw this case being a battle of the experts, as many of these cases are, because these dueling experts provide alternative explanations for the jury's consideration. The question is which one of those explanations is more reasonable and is more consistent with the rest of the evidence. That's what the jury does during the deliberation, is they do that comparison.
Right now, Derek Chauvin is facing 3 separate charges: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter. What is the difference between all 3 of these charges, and what's the likelihood that he will be charged for it of all 3?
Well, remember, if they read the first count first, which is the one that carries up to 40 years, which is the second-degree murder, the unintentional depraved heart murder, there's lots of different ways you characterize it. But let's just call that the most serious charge. If he were to be convicted of that, you can believe he's going to be convicted of the other 2. But not necessarily vice versa. So if they read that charge first and it's not guilty, I can imagine everybody's going to be, already upset. But that doesn't mean that the jury won't and hasn't found him guilty of one or both of the lower charges. Obviously, another difference is punishment. It is more serious to be convicted of the highest charge, and that carries the most potential prison time. And then, of course, you go from the highest charge, 40, to the second, 25 potential years, and then 10 for the lowest. But like you said, they can find him guilty of both 3. It just depends on what they believe he was thinking, and obviously they will already found that he was, in fact, the cause of George Floyd's death.
Doing a live look inside the courtroom, we are still waiting on the jury to come out and for the verdict to be read so that we actually know what is the outcome of this case, at least so far. But one other person who is going to be inside of that courtroom when the verdict is read is George Floyd's brother, Phalonis Floyd. He'll be inside of the courtroom listening to the verdict as it comes down. What is it like for a victim's family member to be in the courtroom waiting to know the outcome?
When I was a younger lawyer earlier in my career, I used to complain about how stressful it was as a prosecutor to go in and take a verdict. I've learned over the years the real victims and the real family members talk about stress. They are the ones that suffer the most not knowing, because it's that closure or not closure, or what is it going to be. They are the ones, and our hearts just go out to them in terms of being calm and not being anxious. Easier said than done. But they are really the ones that are so impacted by verdicts. And I understand verdicts can't bring back family members that have been killed, that have been raped, that have been burglarized, all the different crimes.
It's hard not to watch I'll have the volume on my TV. It's hard not to watch I'll have the volume on my TV. Oh shit. Sorry. So I just went on my phone and realized that I am watching it on my phone, and it messed up the volume. I'm gonna mess up the sound. Oh, stop that. My voice sounds like that? Why didn't you guys tell me that? My voice sounds like that? Why didn't you guys tell me that? So right now, outside of the courtroom, Derek Chauvin's girlfriend is speaking. They're having like this. I'm gonna play it so that way you guys can hear it. It's just loading up. So it's gonna be funny. Whew. Okay, I guess she's not speaking anymore. I mean, the one thing that is kind of has brings me a little optimism is that this was an extremely diverse jury. So like in a lot of the other cases when you have a police officer being accused of murder, and the jury is pretty much one, race. This was definitely not the case. And it varied in age and race, so it wasn't, here's what it is.
Coming in courtrooms, but they are also the ones that really suffer in a way that we don't understand, being public or lawyers or even being the judge presiding over the case, because it is so personal and usually so painful. At the very least, when justice is done, it gives them a measure of closure, and that's a wonderful thing to have happen. We're going to find out very soon if that's going to happen here.
And what's so unique about Philonise Florida is that he did take the stand. He shared testimony. The testimony is what's called spark of life testimony. How can a family member's testimony help the outcome of this case?
Well, the family member's testimony is often important to jurors in terms of judging somebody's character, whether their past behavior mentioned, all different ways. It cannot be used in ways in which the judge doesn't permit it to be used. And character evidence comes in a variety of different types of trials for exactly that.
And we're talking about a lot of things that are happening inside the courtroom, and we're focusing in on the verdict, which is expected to happen anytime now, between 3:30 and 4.
I don't like this station. She seems to not be able to learn, know how to use her freaking mic.
So we're still waiting on that. But when it comes to policing in America, what Chauvin trial?
I can't stress enough. Okay, this is the perfect opportunity to say this because this video, YouTube will keep this video posted as opposed to Facebook getting lost in the stream. One of the most important things that folks need to start to understand, right? Shut up, lady.
Even the last several years. And remember, even the prosecution team in this.
Okay. One of the most important things that folks have to understand, you must understand, is that in order to affect change in this country, you're not going to be able to just, go and storm the United States Capitol or go and, loot and riot and burn everything down. As much as I would love to see that happen if this doesn't come back that way, at the same time, it's just not the responsible thing to do. If we ever want to really, and this is not just black, white, if we ever, as the people, as the bottom 99% of this country, ever want to take this country back, it's about running and winning local elections. It's never going to be about protesting. It's never going to be about rioting, because as it's been proven with, some of the folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and the names of the 60s civil rights movement, look where we are today. It has accomplished very little in the overall spectrum.
businesses here, lower rent, and put up more boards to protect their building. When this verdict, the news came that the verdict was reached, we were inside of a church at 38th in Chicago. If you sit down inside of the sanctuary of that church and look out the window, you can see George Floyd Square. You see into the veil, into his life, you see the lights so that when you speak that story, the jury has reached a verdict. He and his wife said their heart dropped, but they found a bit of comfort knowing the jury reached a verdict so quickly. And one thing they also pointed out, so many have asked him, what do you think the outcome will be? He said they're not necessarily worried about the outcome. The bigger question at this hour is what is most important. And they talked about humanity. He talked about the people he served for nearly 40 years on that corner. Like Floyd, he moved to Minneapolis from Texas. And like other people in that community, he had issues with members of law enforcement at a young age. He said he had an encounter with police that left him with a traumatic brain injury. And he wants to use that experience.
So it's so funny because I switch between Fox and CNN when like I'm trying to figure out like the in between of what's really going on, and they CNN is just, I mean, both channels, don't get me wrong, both channels are very hypocritical, but CNN like one of the commentators was like, yeah, I knew about the verdict before anybody else because the marshal told me. Like, you just got this man fired.
Thanks so much. I want to go back to CNN's Don Lemon. And Don, one of the most remarkable things about this trial, about the George Floyd case, and I don't know if my team has those murals, the pictures of those murals ready, but there have been pictures, paintings, murals of George Floyd around the world, in Pakistan, England, all over, as a symbol of injustice in the hands of the government. This case has taken on a truly international meaning, representing the idea of people who do not deserve it being put down, being killed, being oppressed by their governments, often because of racism, but also just in general, government versus people. Yeah, and it all started in Minneapolis, which is now George Floyd Square, George Floyd Square, obviously before this happened. But it's also transformed in many ways to a Black Lives Matter way, which is in DC where but I think the reason for it being such a symbol is obviously because number one, I really do think that it was the attention that this particular case got because of the because people didn't know what was going to happen next. Because we didn't know our government was going to say more or we said, what was going to happen with my job and so on. We have to remember where we were a year ago and not very far, on we're basically sitting in the same place and we're all sitting at home in quarantine. And I think the whole world is watching because America did this. I mean, just the world is to America as a symbol of democracy. And if there's any place in the world that we guarantee freedom and that we guarantee creation sins, and to see this atrocity happen on a city street in the middle of the day. In the United States, it's just something that people could not wrap their heads around worldwide. People have heard of it as well for people of color, particularly for the congregation. Now, a lot of those things that people say, well, maybe it's an exaggeration for having this confirmation. I think that for many people around the world, it was just sheer, they were just stunned to think something like that was happening. It's not, it's worse than it's so
Sure.
just to take a step back, Black Lives Matter movement, as I
In this case, was very.
about it, was in 2015.
Oh, I don't know if you just, Mark, if you're still here, I don't know if you just heard what he just said. He just said Black Lives Matter movement. as opposed to Black Lives Matter Global Foundation. But don't get me started on that.
Presumption of innocence and reasonable doubt. That's just the way it is. Like it or lump it. It's what makes us the shining beacon on the hill. It's what makes us the envy of nations around the world. Is that we actually abide by the rule of law. Nobody comes to your house and throws a hood over your head and takes you to a gulag, sight unseen from thereafter. So we do have this system. And in that system, it needs to be respected that someone's going to be unhappy and someone's going to be happy. It's the way justice is served, but it's important to know that justice isn't always something that makes you happy, but it has to be respected in this country. And I hope I don't sound like a Pollyanna, guys. I really hope I don't, but I did hear some remarkable litigation from these attorneys, both on the state side and on the defense. And the defense has one job, and it's not to prove innocence. It is to prove or raise a reasonable doubt. And so what is reasonable to you may not be reasonable to your neighbor, but it's the 12 jurors.
And after this course of
Mark that serial.
a conviction potentially. Again, we're waiting on this jury's announcement momentarily here. What would the prosecution have to prove in order to secure that most serious conviction on second-degree murder, which carries the heaviest potential punishment?
Right. That's a great question, Rob. And I think it's also one that not everybody might understand, because second degree still requires some intent to be proven. And let me break that down. In other jurisdictions, they call it felony murder. So for instance, in the commission of a felony, a death occurred. That's effectively what we're looking at here. So the felony that's underlying this second degree murder charge is assault. And the prosecution went to great lengths to explain to this jury that you need to decide that Officer Chauvin had an intent to hurt George Floyd. And some people might say that he was just doing his job. That's not an intent to hurt someone. But the prosecutor was able to say, well, he was twisting his finger to use pain to get him to comply, or he was, pressing his face into the ground, and that hurt, and so that he intended to hurt. And then the defense would say, but that is all in the line of duty, and there's reasonable force, which you have to hurt people in order to apply reasonable force. So there was a good argument to be made there, and this jury's been had to wrestle with that. So that's the effective issue at hand for that top charge, Rob. And as you can see, it's not that simple. And if you sit through the whole trial and you watch all the evidence, you would realize how hard that job is, because they're not trying a person like you and me. They're trying a person who has to use force and pain in the regular carrying out of his duties. Does that make sense?
Sure.
It does, actually. And one thing that I think that we can't help but look at is the insight that we had yesterday into the conversations between the judge and the attorneys in this case. And as the jury goes to deliberate the facts of the case, which as a legal analyst, with somebody who has followed what goes on in the courtrooms for years, and also all of the experts we've had on, the facts of the case should lead out, right? That should be what the jury is focused on. But they also talked a lot yesterday, actually, about the influences and the bias, the inherent bias that comes in with any jury. And to be honest, this is the most high-profile case of police misconduct, accusations of police misconduct we have seen in decades. So the impact that may have had on this jury has to be something that rises to the surface. It certainly did in the conversations and the concerns, at least from the defense yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, Marnie, you hit the nail on the head. It was the issue for Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, yesterday, in which he said, Judge, I've never seen anything like this. These jurors were going to and from every day during the trial through protests and flashbangs over another shooting. And they were driving in and out of court each day seeing signs and protesters and locks on the fences and National Guard. It is not lost on them. You can ask them not to watch the news, but you can't ask them not to watch the news. yesterday the issue that was raised in a motion for mistrial yesterday, just as the jury was going into deliberations. And it even brought up the notion that the president made some incendiary comments over the weekend that easily could have led into the jurors' advice because they were sequestered over the weekend. And it prompted the judge even to call those comments abhorrent. And, I'll paraphrase the representative who understandably is upset and called for, more confrontation on the streets if there isn't a verdict that she wants or that the supporters wanted of guilty. So the judge said, look, this is a co-equal branch of government. The legislature and the judicial branches are co-equal. Don't do that. And, to hear a judge actually articulate something like that about a U.S. representative, I just found so incredible to hear it in a courtroom during a motion for mistrial. Now, he denied the motion for mistrial, but guys, he said something really poignant, and that was this could be an issue for appeal. And by the way, I've marked down I think 5 issues for appeal, and I don't even think I've got them all. I just sort of grabbed them off the top of my head. But there were a number of different issues, that could be raised on appeal if Officer Chauvin is found guilty of any or all. But I will say this, and I shouldn't bet my lunch on it, but unless he's convicted of the top charge, I would think that the defense would think it might be considered a win. They were prepared, according to the New York Times, to plead guilty to the second-degree manslaughter charge and serve 10 years. So if they were to get that verdict, a guilty on that bottom charge of manslaughter, I don't know that it would be such a wise decision to appeal it, because I've seen it go the other way. I've seen it, appeals processes yield to a trial that yields a worse sentence.
It's anybody's guess at this point, and actually we are waiting for that verdict to come down from the jury at any moment. Stand by, we'll come back to you. Thank you, as always, for your insight. I'm going to bring in Wendy Patrick.
The prosecution
now.
has
She's
the sole
an attorney who's
responsibility
also been watching this closely for the last few weeks. She has joined us numerous times on News Nation. Wendy, first of all, top of mind, how quickly it has taken the jury to come back with a verdict on this.
Absolutely, and I think my friend Ashley summed it up very well when she indicated that in most cases, conventional wisdom is a quick verdict is a good win for the prosecution. But then there's that O.J. Simpson case, and that's the outlier. And I would especially say it's the outlier in a case like this, where the jury had options. They had 3 different charges to choose from, and they reached verdicts on all 3 in a very short amount of time in comparison to the amount of time they actually spent in trial, which was closer to 3 weeks, and the amount of evidence and witnesses they saw. Not to mention all the different angles of the body-worn camera footage, the cell phone footage. So they did not have a difficult time in coming to verdicts here, which would be one reason to believe that they did come to guilty verdicts. Now, the only wild card would be whether or not that would also include the highest charge, because that would require the most significant element of intent. And they didn't have ex-officer Chauvin's testimony because he invoked and he chose not to testify. So that would be the only thing that I would wonder about, is did they also find the top charge guilty as well?
And Wendy, this is Nicole here. Much of this seems to have been decided in the court of public opinion. Of course, we know that doesn't matter, that it does come down to those 12 jurors. But with that being said, are you surprised that the judge did not decide to sequester the jury over the weekend?
Nicole, I've gone back and forth on that question over the course of the trial, because there was an issue right from the beginning that maybe they should have been sequestered. This isn't just a high-profile case. This is the most high-profile case we've seen in years. It came at just this perfect storm time-wise, where we had civil unrest due to other incidents, other cases. The pandemic had everybody shut down. Tensions were high. So it really did present a number of circumstances that the judge would have been.
Remember that time where they told us that they were going to have a verdict. However, and it didn't take 30 years?
Hand, the jurors, we have to give them the benefit of the doubt and believe that they're going to do what they say they're going to do in avoiding news coverage. But as been pointed out by several of your other guests, how do you do that when you live in the jurisdiction? It's one thing to say I won't turn on the television, I won't look at my Facebook feed, but you have to go to and from the courthouse. In other words, you have to be out in public and you can't escape. the pervasive trial publicity there. That'll no doubt be one of the avenues for appeal in addition to some of the others. But so that was one of the things the judge had to consider. But I mean, I have to believe he knows what he's doing also. And in the balance, he found sequestration to be appropriate for deliberations, but not throughout the trial.
And Wendy, the jury makeup here is fascinating. I mentioned this a few minutes ago. 5 men, 7 women, so fairly even along gender lines. 6 white, 6 non-white on the jury. What impact do you think that may have on the verdict here to have a jury that more than others resembles the country?
Well, I think it's great that you have a jury that resembles the country, and the impact that a demographically consistent jury has on a verdict might, in one sense, be a good thing in terms of different perspectives. But on the other hand, there's also this element of following the law, and there's nothing that you bring to the table that absolves you in any way, shape, or form of your duty to follow the law. So in a perfect world, there wouldn't be such a thing as a jury of your peers. It would be everybody taking an oath and doing the absolute best they can to ensure that they don't allow bias, prejudice to infiltrate their decision. But we're all human beings, so that's why we need both. We need jurors to vow to follow the law, but demographic consistency that mirrors the community at large is also a very good thing.
All right, Wendy Patrick, attorney, thank you so much for your insight. I know we will be checking back in with you later on this evening. We're going to send it now out to correspondent Brian Enton. He is live in Minneapolis among the protesters, demonstrators that have gathered there.
But this is a certain timeout because he said that.
Right outside the Hennepin County courthouse where these protesters have gathered, people starting to get word that there is a verdict and coming downtown close to the courthouse. Let me show you what the scene is out here. I'd say at least a couple hundred people here so far, and the crowd continues to grow out here. People really just on edge, on pins and needles. That's the way the city has been for the last month, and it has really amped up over the last 24 hours since the jury started deliberating. Up until now, sort of like a ghost town downtown. A lot of the businesses are closed, boarded up. All the hotels and restaurants are boarded up. And we actually heard a short time ago that some of the buildings in this area even started to send people home, worried about There's about 3,000 National Guard right now in the city of Minneapolis alone. They mobilized several thousand more over the weekend and brought them into town. Also a major law enforcement presence. You've got Minneapolis police officers working 12-hour shifts. You've also got state troopers here, and they've also called in law enforcement from other states to help with security here, just in case the crowds get out of control. But right now, very, very peaceful scene here. People optimistic about the verdict, especially since it came so quickly, and everyone here really just in a wait-and-see mode.
And Brian, for folks at home, you have also been covering the death and the police-involved shooting of Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, which of course is not far from downtown Minneapolis. Can you talk a little bit about the plan by law enforcement tonight as we await a verdict, we eventually understand what has happened with the jury, and then leading into tonight, the plan by law enforcement to maintain peace and to keep people safe? What have they alluded as to a plan? We've seen other cities, Chicago, for example, talking about how they would handle large crowds and when things do spiral into unrest.
Yeah, Marty, they called the plan here Operation Safety Net. They started that plan when the trial started, and basically all of the municipalities in this area, so Minneapolis Police, the Sheriff's Office, the troopers, and all of the surrounding towns and cities have come together under this umbrella called Operation Safety Net so that they can all coordinate the response together. As of their briefing yesterday, again, thousands of law enforcement on the ground here. But what they emphasized is that they were really going to take a hands-off approach to all of this unless it was necessary. No tear gas, no rubber bullets, they said police officers would stay at a distance unless it became necessary. And it was interesting, the Minneapolis police chief said they would not use any of those kinds of tactics like the tear gas and the rubber bullets without approval specifically from the police chief himself. Obviously, the hope is that it won't come back.
All right, Brian mentioned for us. We'll continue to check in with you, Brian. Thank you. We want to go now to Jill Correa, who is in Washington, D.C. see at Black Lives Matter Plaza. And I want to let everybody at home know we do have our correspondents stationed around the country in the major cities that could be impacted by tonight's verdict. Atlanta, Los Angeles, Portland as well. And Joe, let's go to you now and see what you're hearing about any potential plans tonight as we look.
That it took the jury to deliberate more.
Well, Black Lives Matter Plaza, we expect that as the night continues, it's going to show up a little bit more and more. Now we're getting a little bit almost in the shadow of the White House. And as far right now as we can see, it's just smaller groups that are here. I think media and law enforcement may outnumber the people. But we can expect more to come later on. Remember, this is a pretty iconic location when we talk about the Greenfield State. There have been more last attempts from over the summer. The protests here stretching from the White House all the way as far as the island. See, I mean, this place literally became known as Black Lives Matter Plaza during that time. The church was St. John's Church right next to us where, remember, they large group of protesters inside. Cleared up on that. They followed them and that is now known out there. Right in the middle of Black Lives Matter Plaza, whether or not from the city of Los
So it appears that the everyone is in the courtroom except for the jury and the judge. They were just waiting for the judge and the jury to come into the courtroom.
We've seen some people who sort of we know that we may lose some statements from some influential members of Congress or the speak at peace. Will be speaking at some point after that verdict too. So it's a lot of apprehension, a lot of you can feel some nerves as people slowly gather in this area. And again, we expect that throughout the night we're going to see larger crowds come through. I think we're being told by the police officer to just back up there, so we're going to stand and just be safe. But no, that's what we're seeing here so far. I should mention also that the last time we were here, there were more protests, and you could not see the White House because there were loads of fences up, and there was cover with people who had been killed at the hands of police. Last time, it's been cleared out, and you can now see the White House. Those images came down, but it wasn't really long ago. It was these protests dominating these streets here. So we're going to keep an eye on everything. It remains peaceful. The national guard has got to be clear that we only have a full national guard presence here in Washington. I haven't seen it yet. I actually might expect that there is a national guard presence. We're not seeing that right now. There are still national guards who show up on the Capitol side. But this is typically the area in Washington that we have these demonstrations where people gather. So they're waiting for that. Certainly that may change. We're going to make sure that everything here, these situations often become fluid in what's happening. But we've seen a lot of people even now looking around. They're sort of glued to their phones, waiting any moment now for a new one. And again, we expect more to come through as the night progresses.
The judge has just entered the building.
For the deal and the similar events in kind of all corners of the country. So there's so much at stake.
All right, so the judge has entered the building. The jury is now entering the building. And here we go. Here it goes. Here it goes. Here it goes. Here it goes. This is probably the most nerve-wracking thing that most of us have done the last couple of months, is to go through this.
Please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin. District Court, 4th Judicial District, State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror 4-person, juror number 19.
Praise
Same
God.
caption,
Praise God.
verdict, count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury 4-person, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict, count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to the 20th day of April, 2021.
Guilty. Wow.
PM. Jury 4-person, 019.
Wow.
Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts.
Wow.
Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Wow.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Wow.
Yes.
Juror number 19,
Wow.
are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Wow.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91,
I'm going to end the live broadcast now.
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts of saying one, so say all?